Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, of course, I thought that I would give my little fight prediction and my fight analysis on the unification fight that is going to end up happening tomorrow. And that is between the two light heavyweight champions, or two of the light heavyweight champions of the world, in a somewhat decently talented division. I would not necessarily say that this division is within my top three most talented divisions in all of boxing right now, but maybe you could argue that it's somewhat around middle of the pack. But Artur Beterbiev and Joe Smith Jr. should be a very entertaining and a very decent fight indeed. Now, of course, both of these fighters, they are current champions at the moment. This is going to be a unification fight. I believe that Joe Smith Jr. at the time holds the WBO light heavyweight championship of the world. And Artur Beterbiev, I believe that he has the IBF and the WBC belts. And then, of course, you have Mr. Dimitri Bivol, who still has his WBA belt and was able to defeat Canelo Alvarez in pretty decent, impressive fashion in his last fight, who, of course, I had as my former number one pound for pound fighter in the world. But, anyways, just to talk about this fight and how I believe this fight is going to occur and who I believe is going to win this fight, I thought that I would give my quick little breakdown and overall what I believe is going to happen in the fight and why. And if you personally had to ask me who I believe is going to win this fight, and I don't think that this is really going to be much of a surprise, but I have to go with Mr. Artur Beterbiev. And the reason why I have to go with Artur Beterbiev is because I think that he is the smarter fighter. I think that he is the greater athlete, and that is saying quite a bit when we talk about someone like that of a Joe Smith Jr. Joe Smith Jr. is a fighter to where he really does have the potential to knock your lights out, really even with just one punch. We've seen it, of course, against Bernard Hopkins several years ago, even though Bernard Hopkins pretty much, of course, was nowhere near the same of what he used to be. But I believe that that was the only time, at least from what I remember, to where Bernard Hopkins was actually legitimately knocked out. And Joe Smith Jr. has just A grade raw power. But Artur Beterbiev, who of course is across the ring from him or will be tomorrow night, he may even have more devastating power than what a Joe Smith Jr. has. Artur Beterbiev at that light heavyweight division, he might be one of the most devastating punchers that I personally have ever seen, probably within my time of watching boxing. He has a 100% knockout ratio, and that is even over decent fighters like that of Alexander Vosdik, a Marcus Brown, and there may even be a couple of other boxers at the current moment in time I'm not necessarily thinking of. But this is going to be a very interesting fight. A lot of people, of course, believe that this is going to be a barn burner. Certain people may believe that this fight is going to be close, but I do have to go with Artur Beterbiev in this fight. He is getting older, so we will see if maybe the age has affected him, maybe if he has slowed down. But the last fight that I seen him in against Marcus Brown, which did have the potential to be an upset if Marcus Brown played his cards right, but Artur Beterbiev was just too much. Not only that, but Marcus Brown probably was a little bit too flawed to beat that of an Artur Beterbiev. And I would say that Joe Smith Jr., that he probably is a level or two below that of an Artur Beterbiev. I don't believe that Joe Smith Jr. compared to Artur Beterbiev is an A-grade fighter. I believe that this is an A or A plus fighter, at least for the light heavyweight division, facing a fighter that, at least compared to him, is probably a B plus fighter. I believe that Artur Beterbiev will be the better counterpuncher. I believe that he will be more defensively responsible. And I believe that maybe for probably the second time in Joe Smith Jr.'s career, at least from what I've seen, he's going to once again find himself probably outpowered and outgunned and also outstrategized in this fight. The first time we've seen it was, of course, against the very great light heavyweight fighter, Mr. Dimitri Bivol. And I believe that it is going to happen once again in this fight. I just think that Artur Beterbiev is the smarter fighter. I believe that Artur Beterbiev is going to work off of his jab, and I believe all in all that he's going to try to land that right hand early, go to the body. And I think that it'll be competitive probably for the first maybe three, maybe even the first half of the fight within the first 6 rounds. But I believe at around the fifth or sixth round that Joe Smith Jr. will start to find that Artur Beterbiev's punches, that it'll just be a little bit too much. And I believe that he is going to start to back up. I believe that he's going to realize very quickly that this guy is another level of fighter, very similar to that of a Dimitri Bivol, that this person's punching power is no joke, and that on top of that, his counter punching ability and his better defensive responsibility and his higher boxing IQ is going to get him basically the victory. And I do believe eventually that Artur Beterbiev more than likely will stop him. But if it did go to decision, I would not be surprised. But I have Artur Beterbiev winning this fight. I have him winning this fight probably within about 10 rounds. I'm going to say 10 rounds by a stoppage. I believe that Joe Smith Jr. will try to give it a great effort, but I believe that eventually he will be on the back foot, and I do not think that Joe Smith Jr. is necessarily a great fighter on the back foot. He is mainly a pressure fighter, and if you can take him out of that territory, he does become somewhat limited. And Artur Beterbiev seems to have good enough stamina, good enough consistent power, good enough counter-punching ability, defensive responsibility to get his opponents out of there. And I thought that he looked very impressive in his last fight against Marcus Brown, where Marcus Brown did try to show some decent movement and boxing ability, but Artur Beterbiev was able to completely out-strategize him, and he was able to completely pound him into submission. And I believe that something very similar is going to happen here with Joe Smith Jr. I believe that he will more than likely be out of there within 10 rounds. Maybe Joe Smith's power may be able to fight him back to keep him in there for a little bit longer than some of his previous opponents. But all in all, I believe that Artur Beterbiev will be victorious. But we'll see all in all what ends up happening. But anyways, that's pretty much my prediction for this fight. I believe that Artur Beterbiev, yes, both of these fighters are great power punchers, but Artur Beterbiev is just the all-around greater and better fighter than Joe Smith Jr. I think is on a higher caliber level. And I believe that Artur Beterbiev, even though he's a little bit older in age, I believe that overall that he is pretty much at the peak of his career. And we will see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I will talk to you all later. My pick is Mr. Artur Beterbiev, and we shall see what happens.